The New World Order in history has always been established with wars, and borders have been determined according to the results of these wars. Now, the war between Ukraine and Russia in the Eastern European bloc is laying the foundation of the global order in the Asia-Pacific. Vladimir Putin's stance on invading Ukraine turned the global conjuncture upside down. The effects of the war have now extended beyond the territory of Ukraine to the Indo-Pacific. The reshaping of relations between international partnerships will depend on what will happen in this line of tension. China was the first to ignite the fuse in the tension line. The military exercise initiated by China after Taiwan's leader, Tsai Ing-wen's visit to the United States, made the Pacific quite active. Taiwan's Ministry of Defense reported that air defense forces were on high alert after the exercise around the island. China has sent warplanes and warships around Taiwan as part of a 3-day military exercise initiated by Taiwan President Tsai Ing-wen. After a meeting with the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, Taiwan's Ministry of Defense reported that 58 Chinese military aircraft and 9 warships were detected around the island. According to the ministry's statement, these included Su-30 warplanes and H-6 bombers. On the first day of the exercise, it was announced that 71 aircraft and 9 ships belonging to China were detected in the Taiwan Strait. In response to this situation, the Taiwanese army announced that its missile defense systems were activated and air and sea patrols were launched to follow Chinese warplanes. The People's Liberation Army of China announced that these exercises will be held as a serious warning against Taiwan's pro-independence forces in order to protect China's territorial integrity. It was stated that the exercises will be held in the north, south, and east of Taiwan. Air defense forces were reported to be on high alert. After the striking step, the focus turned to the USA. The whole world expected a counter-move from the USA against this move of China. Accordingly, it was reported that the U.S. warship carrying guided missiles passed through the Taiwan Strait for the first time after China's military exercise around Taiwan Island last week. In the statement made by the U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet in the Pacific, it was stated that the Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer USS Milius passed through a corridor in the Bosphorus that is not included in the territorial waters of any coastal state. The passage of the USS Milius through the Taiwan Strait was described as a symbol of the United States' commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific. This transit was the first cruise activity of the United States in the Taiwan Strait after the military exercise organized around the island. After Tsai Ing-wen, the leader of Taiwan, with which China is in a sovereignty conflict, visited the United States and met with the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Kevin McCarthy. China, on the other hand, accused the U.S. of exaggerating the passage of the ship. Senior Colonel Kai, the spokesperson of the Eastern Front Command responsible for the eastern coast regions of the Chinese People's Liberation Army, including Taiwan, confirmed that the U.S. ship had passed through the Taiwan Strait and made statements that this passage increased the tension. But the tension in the Pacific has reached its peak with the last move of the USA in the past days following the passage of the USS Milius through the Taiwan Strait. The U.S. Navy member USS Benfold conducted a triple ballistic missile defense exercise. This last military exercise of the USA fell like a bomb on the world agenda. The USA, which does not want China to pose a serious threat in Taiwan and its surroundings, has made it felt that it is the guarantor of Taiwan. With this latest exercise, Russia, one of China's supporters, was another side that took action against the US's numerous exercises in the Pacific in the last few weeks. Warships of the Russian Pacific Fleet held an anti-submarine exercise in the Sea of Japan. Warships also opened artillery fire at sea and air targets during the immediate readiness check. In the news published by the Russian state news agency TASS on the subject, Russian ships that left their permanent bases and came to the designated exercise area carried out tactical maneuvers in different formats. It was also stated that these Russian Navy members provided defense against any attack on the naval convoy. While on the move, Sergei Merkulov, the commander of the frigate Marshal Shaposhnikov, announced the completion of all missions. Merkulov also stated that his team had no difficulty in the sudden readiness inspection, as they'd been training almost every week since January at the instruction of Russian President Vladimir Putin. In addition to the Navy and Air Forces, Russian ground forces and support troops also participated in this exercise, as 400 and pantsir defense systems were deployed in the region as part of the ongoing exercise of the Pacific Fleet of the Russian Army in the Kurile and Sakhalin regions where there are disagreements with Japan. In a statement made by the Russian Ministry of Defense, it was stated that the Pacific Fleet started combat duty in the newly designated areas to check the combat readiness of the air defense units. In the continuation of this exercise, the air defense units of the Russian Pacific Fleet took action against the imaginary enemy. In addition, the Russian Pacific Fleet air units carried out the tasks of repelling the attack of the enemy attack and reconnaissance groups and detecting air targets by the pantsir crews as part of the exercise. With the involvement of Russia, the U.S. side stated that they will continue to work on minimizing this tension in the Indo-Pacific. The U.S. Pacific commanders stated that they are ready for any eventuality regarding Taiwan. Commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Forces, Admiral John C. Aquilino spoke with Jedediah Royal, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Indo-Pacific Region Security Affairs, and General Paul LaCamera, the U.S. commander of the Korean forces at a session of the House of Representatives Armed Forces Committee on Security Challenges in the Pacific region. Admiral John C. Aquilino stressed that China is responsible for preventing a possible attack on Taiwan. The U.S. commander stated that it's necessary to work to deter Beijing without fueling clashes with China. In addition, Aquilino added that it's necessary to act with a greater sense of urgency every day against a possible clash in the region. In short, the cool waters of the Pacific have come to a boil due to tensions between China, the USA, Taiwan, and Russia. This tension, which began with the exercises carried out by China, still continues fiercely. The Beijing administration, on the other hand, made a critical statement about why they held the exercises. The Chinese People's Liberation Army stated that these exercises will be held as a serious warning against Taiwan's pro-independence forces in order to protect China's territorial integrity. While all these statements continue to keep the tension in the world political arena constantly high, there has been a move that will add a whole new dimension to the critical relations in the Pacific. NATO announced that it's taken a striking step in response to the threat that China and Russia pose in the Indo-Pacific and Sea of Japan in cooperation. NATO will hold its annual combat exercise Defender 23, in a concept that will be considered the first in history. 9,000 U.S. soldiers and 17,000 soldiers from other NATO members are participating in the exercise. The exercise, which will last about 2 months, focuses on the strategic deployment of U.S.-based forces, the use of military prepositioned stockpiles, and interoperability with European allies and partners. In summary, the war in Ukraine has reached the stage that is now affecting the whole world and creating a huge political tsunami in the Pacific. It is about to share with you again what moves the parties will make in the coming days. One of the main objectives of the Ukrainian armed forces is the evacuation of civilians from Crimea after the attacks, because in this way they will be able to act more comfortably against the Russian army in their attacks. The sensitivity of the Kherson counterattack had cost them a great deal of time, but no matter what, Vladimir Putin continues to mobilize his army to protect the region. However, the psychological damage of the attacks on Crimea was much more effective than expected, and many of the Russians had already left Crimea before these measures were taken. Especially families of Russian officers in Crimea are evacuated. So why is Crimea being evacuated? And through which roads do the Russian residents of Crimea flee? Let's dive into the reasons for the evacuation of the Russians in the Crimea after the Ukrainian attacks and the turmoil within the Russian army. As Divine Justice, we strive to bring you the most striking news, collective and accurate information from the front by working hard day and night with our expert staff as quickly as possible. By subscribing to our channel, you can support glorious struggle for Ukraine. The residents of Crimea have already greatly increased their escape from the peninsula since the first days of February 2023. Now, as a result of the last striking attack by the Ukrainian forces on the peninsula, the escapes and evacuations have reached their peak, especially after the drone attacks on Sevastopol. The voyages of some Russian ships in the Black Sea were prevented. Today, however, news emerged that some additional flights have begun to be rescheduled in the peninsula with the opening of the Kerch Bridge to traffic. The flight from Crimea to Russia has increased even more. Russian residents and pro-Russian officials and their families in the Crimea are fleeing to Krasnodar via the Kerch Bridge. The resumption of mass escapes by the residents of the peninsula with some additional expeditions that began today has seriously stirred up the atmosphere in Crimea. The families and relatives of the Russian forces on the peninsula had been making preparations to flee from the Crimea for a long time. The residents of the peninsula who were preparing to flee by selling their immovable properties and real estate, as well as the families of the soldiers and the relatives of the Russian authorities, began to be evacuated. The Chief of General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reported this week that the families of Russian invaders were deported to Russia from Perevolnoye in the Crimea. The Chief of Staff report says once again, certain categories of citizens are being evacuated from temporarily occupied Crimea. Recently, military personnel of the Russian occupation forces stationed in Perevolnoye are sending their families to Russia. Also, Russian administrations in temporarily occupied Crimea are drawing up evacuation plans for their employees. In the report of the Crimean National Resistance Group, it was stated that the occupants had made a list of workers and their families subject to priority evacuation, and that in some cities the plans had already been drawn up and approved. Offices in Russian-occupied Simferopol prepare to evacuate. This was reported by the Telegram channel Crimean Wind. It is reported that in the so-called state-owned enterprises of Simferopol, officers were asked to fill out questionnaires in which, in case of evacuation, the full name of the evacuees and the composition of the family were indicated. The official reason given on the forms was earthquake. However, the channel points out that since it's not yet possible to predict earthquakes, it can be assumed that officials were evacuated due to the threat of the Ukrainian army advancing on the peninsula. The inhabitants of Crimea are doing their best to escape from the peninsula, while the escapees reached incredible numbers. The latest reports show that the Russians are leaving the Crimea en masse after 2014. Mostly Russians settled in Crimea, and Putin, who took the majority of the population, has ruled this region for a long time. The Russian population in Crimea is around 1.5 million, and half of this was settled in Crimea after 2014. Now, according to these data, the Russian population in Crimea is still around 50%. But before the Ukrainian attacks, it was around 62.5 million people live in Crimea. Russians are the ethnic group with the highest density of 60%. However, as it can be understood from here, it is estimated that approximately 250,000 Russians left Crimea. These include mostly Russians, but other ethnic populations are thought to have fled as well. While this figure is increasing day by day, the proxy Russian administration cannot do anything to stop the escape from the peninsula because the inhabitants received serious socio-economic injuries due to this war. The high prices of even the most basic needs in Crimea make it very difficult to make a living there. The Crimean Tatar leader and regional experts predict that at least 500,000 more Russians may leave the peninsula by the summer. On the other hand, the Russian authorities on the peninsula cannot make them believe that Crimea is protected from attacks and to hide the heavy losses of the war in order to calm the panic in Crimea and prevent the escape of the peninsula residents. Explosions at the naval headquarters of the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Crimea and at major Russian airports not only caused an earthquake in the Kremlin, but also struck deep fear into the hearts of the Russian population in Crimea. The Russian Ministry of Defense declared a state of emergency in the peninsula. This emergency included a series of military measures and measures to prevent the Russian people from leaving the peninsula. However, it seems that the escape and evacuation of Russian civilians and even relatives of soldiers from the peninsula cannot be prevented. The Russians had deployed most of the air defense systems in the southern regions of Ukraine to the Crimea. But despite all these measures, the Ukrainian forces could repeatedly target the peninsula with UAVs, and even the purpose of some of the Ukrainian airstrikes on the peninsula was only to learn the location of the Russian air defense systems. Therefore, although the Russians tried to move the air defense systems to Crimea intensively, this situation did not matter much as the Ukrainian forces knew the location of the key strategic defense systems in Crimea. Thanks to the UAV attacks they carried out, Ukrainian forces are focused on the Crimean Peninsula, which will give them a serious advantage from a military and political point of view. Crimea is a very important region for the Russian forces and the Kremlin government. The liberation of Crimea by the Ukrainian forces will not only deal a major blow to Russia's invasion campaign, but also increase the reaction of the Russian people against the Kremlin. Simultaneous with opening a large wedge to the land bridge, Ukrainian forces continue efforts to weaken Crimea. As you know, Russia uses Crimea as a major military base. There are Navy, Air Force and ground forces of the Russian forces in Crimea. Explosions occurred at air bases, arsenals and military bases located in major cities of Crimea. Ukraine's Western allies were deeply concerned about cross-border attacks. However, after the United States announced that it saw Crimea as Ukrainian territory, Western allies began not to worry about attacks on Crimea. Ukrainian forces usually carry out their attacks on Crimea with UAVs. Numerous drone attacks were recorded at points where important Russian military assets are located, such as Inkau, Bakhchisarai, Simferopol, and Sevastopol. Although some of these attacks were neutralized by Russian forces, Ukrainian forces inflicted serious damage on Russian military assets in Crimea. While the subject is UAVs, there are increasing rumors that the Russian forces are experiencing a great decrease in the stock of UAVs. Russian forces have frequently used Iranian-made Shahed suicide drones to target Ukraine's critical infrastructure. However, the attack attempts of the Russian forces with these drones decreased after a 2-week hiatus. Russian forces carried out 14 drone strikes targeting Ukrainian air defense systems the other day. Ukrainian air defense systems neutralized 11 of these attacks while the Russians were able to damage only 1 UAV. Although the hot spot of the war between the Ukrainian and Russian forces is eastern Ukraine, large explosions occur in the Crimean Peninsula. However, in the future, the peninsula will be the hottest point of the war. There is a lot of news from the Donetsk region. Here, Russian forces have been conducting incredibly intense ground attacks until they started running out of forces. Some assault battalions started complaining that the survival rate in Avdiivka is only about 11%. In order to prevent the culmination of their campaign, Russian forces even started sending artilleries into battle. They were given guns and 4-day training and were sent to storm Ukrainian trenches. Last time I told you that Russian forces switched to high-caliber artillery, mortars and air bombs to level with the ground residential area because it did not allow them to approach the city. I also told you that the situation to the north of Avdiivka has stabilized and the Russians did not secure any additional ground. The freshest reports suggest that the area under Russian control is actually smaller than previously estimated. As you remember, during the previous Russian offensive campaign, they were supposed to capture 2 out of 3 Romanian Ukrainian positions. The Russian side recently released combat footage showing how they assaulted and captured a Ukrainian strongpoint north of the settlement. It looks like Russian forces used at least 4 armored vehicles and a lot of infantry. They managed to suppress Ukrainian fire and get closer to the trenches and gradually push the Ukrainians westward. The video also shows that at least a full squad of Ukrainians managed to get away. It looks like there are at least 2 trench networks still under Ukrainian control, one in the western part of the village near the lake and one east of the lake in the tree line. Today, Russian sources reported that they tried to get closer to the trenches but only engaged in positional fights with no changes to the front line. The updated setting indicates that Novobakhmutka is still under partial control of Ukrainians, although due to the geography, the position inside the village itself has almost no tactical value because it is located in a deep valley. So whoever controls the trenches on the hills around it is the one who controls the settlement. This also explains why Russians are attacking the trenches in the tree line from the south and not from the settlement itself. Ukrainian sources also reported a lot of actions around Krasnohorivka. Ukrainian assault drone detachment from the 110th Brigade showed how they effectively prevented another Russian attack. The video features another instance of tight cooperation between artillery and drone operators and shows how the spotted assault squad gets destroyed by artillery fire. Another footage shows the aftermath of an assault from Krasnohorivka that Russians managed to realize Russians lost at least 2 armored vehicles and around a dozen troops. As seen from the map, Russian forces remain vulnerable to counterattacks from the north. So they started taking measures to protect their flanks by mining the area suitable for potential counterattacks. Unfortunately for Russians, Ukrainian drone operators from the 110th Brigade spotted a pile of mines that Russians prepared to use and burned it down. So Ukrainian drone operators are dealing a lot of damage to Russian forces, and their situation is about to deteriorate even further because Ukrainians have recently relocated to Avdiivka. The most famous drone formation, which is Major's Bird's Drone Battalion Russian assault men from the 5th Brigade, recently posted a video where they said that their battalion was completely annihilated in suicidal attacks from Virginia. The battalion initially had 161 soldiers, but after sending one squad after another, only 19 of them are still alive. They said that they were forced to attack because anti-retreat forces in the back threatened to kill everyone who refuses the order. And this is one of the best troops that Russians have because many of them have prior combat experience after fighting in Donbass in 2015 as volunteers. Simultaneously, Russian mobilized soldiers said that after completing the training for artillery instead of artillery, they were given guns and were sent to Donetsk to storm Ukrainian positions. Their families also made a public appeal to the president. Today, British intelligence also reported that Russians are preparing to mobilize 400,000 more people in order to mitigate the countrywide discontent. The mobilization is planned to be announced as voluntary. They already tried to gather at least 1 battalion worth of volunteers in each region and failed. So if they couldn't find even close to 50,000 volunteers, they are unlikely to have 400,000 more. In reality, recruitment offices will just covertly mobilize whomever they can to fulfill the quotas. And some Russian citizens also started mentioning that for some reason they received letters from the recruitment offices with the kind notice to check whether their registered address was up to date in their system. Overall, it looks like after losing thousands of soldiers in Volodya, an additional spike in losses in Avdiivka put a huge strain on the number of assault formations in the regular Russian army and forced them to take drastic measures, such as sending mobilized soldiers that have been trained for 3 months for a completely different job. That is why Russians seem to be preparing for another wave of mobilization. Although with dwindling professional units, a huge inflow of newly mobilized men may degrade the Russian army to the point where everyone barely knows what to do. What do you think about this? As Daily News team, we will continue to closely follow the developments in Russia and bring you the latest news. Our team spends a great deal of effort to prepare these news. You can support our team for the development of independent journalism. For this, you can use the Super Thanks button below the video. We also carefully read your comments on our news. We would like to know what you think about this incident. What do you think was the purpose of this attack? What do you think about the explosions in Russia, and how do you think this will affect the course of the war? Share your thoughts with us. Follow us for more updates.